In 1898, the Ohio River gave back what it had been told to keep. A drought that summer drained the channel at a forgotten ferry landing until the mud gave back a shape of dressed stone that no one living had ever seen. The people who saw it first did not run. They stood on the bank and went quiet the way mountain people go quiet when something older than them is in the room. The old woman who kept the town's stories said she had heard of a people the river took back long before the first settler cut a tree there. A man came down from the college to call it nothing, and the river answered him in a way nobody in that town ever forgot. There is a stretch of the Ohio where the river doesn't so much flow as settle, and a man who has lived on it long enough can read the water the way a preacher reads a page. Hiram Calloway had run the flatboat at Benton's Landing for the better part of 20 years, and before him his father had run it, and before that a man whose name the town no longer remembered. The landing sat on a wide bend between the hills, where the Ohio slowed and spread and got lazy, and where in a dry year the water could pull back from the bank a long way before anyone downstream noticed. By the first week of July in 1898, it had pulled back further than Hiram had ever seen it go, and it was still going. The drought had come on slow that summer, the way they always do in that country, and then it wouldn't leave. The corn twisted in the fields and the springs up in the hollows went thin and quiet, and the river dropped an inch a day until the channel was a brown thread down the middle of a mile of drying mud. The steamboats had stopped running the upper bend weeks before. A boat needs deep water, and a captain needs to get paid, and the Ohio in a drought will give a man neither, so the smokestacks quit coming, and the landing went quiet in a way that felt final. There had been a store at Benton's Landing once, and a post office, and a warehouse where the farmers rolled their tobacco down to the bank to wait for a boat. The store had shut the year before, and the warehouse stood with its doors open and its floor rotting, and the post office was a slot in a woman's kitchen a mile up the road. The people who were left lived back in the hills in houses you couldn't see from the water, and they came down to the bend only when the river gave them a reason. The landing had been dying slow for years, the way landings do when the railroad cuts a new line 20 miles south, and the boats stop needing every wide spot on the bank. Hiram's father had run the flatboat in the years when there was still money in it, carrying tobacco and mail and the occasional traveler across to the Kentucky side. He had told Hiram that a ferryman doesn't own the river. He only rents his understanding of it from year to year. Hiram had thought it was the kind of thing an old man says to sound wise, and then he had gotten old himself and found it was the plain truth. The river was the only boss he had ever had, and in the summer of 1898, the boss was pulling its work out from under him a piece at a time. Hiram didn't mind the quiet. He was a tall man gone gaunt in the way rivermen do, with heavy hands and a face that had stopped showing much of anything years before, and the river was the only thing he had ever asked to understand. He walked the exposed flats at first light every morning to read the channel, to see where the mud was firm and where a man would sink to the knee. He marked in his head whether the flatboat could still cross at the old track. Most mornings there was nothing to see but sandbar and slick clay and the bones of old wrecks the river had chewed on and spit out. On the morning the river gave it back, the light came up gray and low off the hills, and the air on the flats was cool in a way that didn't match July. He was 100 strides out from the bank, walking a line of firm mud toward the channel when he saw the shape. It wasn't a sandbar or a wreck. The thing sat low in the drying mud where the water had only just left it, a flat plane of stone the color of old bone, and the top of it was level in a way that nothing the river ever made came out level. He stopped where he stood and didn't go closer. He had seen 40 years of that river, and he had never seen stone dressed like that come out of it. The river turns rock round and smooth and gray. It doesn't square it and set it flat, and the edge of this thing ran straight as a plumb line out into the mud where the water had only just pulled back. Hiram stood and looked at it and felt the hair on his arms come up, and he couldn't have told you why. He turned and walked back to the bank without touching it, and he went and found his nephew. Wade was 17 that summer, lean and restless, sleeping in the ferry shed because his mother's place up the hollow had gotten too quiet for him since his father died. Hiram didn't tell him what he had seen. He only said, "Come walk the flats with me before the sun gets up." And the boy came without asking, the way he always did. They went back out together in the gray light, and Hiram watched the boy's face when he saw the shape, and he saw the boy go still the same way he had gone still himself. They didn't touch it. They stood at the edge and looked at the flat stone running out into the mud, and Wade said low that it was bigger than he had thought it would be, and Hiram said nothing because the boy was right. What had looked like one slab in the first light was a fitted plane, the stones set tight against each other with no mortar a man could see. It ran out past where the mud was still wet and into the channel where the brown water still moved. Hiram told the boy to keep it to himself for now, and the boy said he would, and they both knew it wouldn't matter. The river was still dropping. By the next morning another stride of the shape was out of the mud, and the day after that another, and a thing that hides only stays hidden as long as the water covers it. Hiram hadn't told a soul, and it didn't make any difference, because a farmer hauling water down to his cattle saw the two of them out there at first light, and put two and two together the way men in a small place do. By noon the bank at Benton's Landing had a knot of men standing on it and staring out at the flats, and not one of them had gone down. They stood on the bank in their collars and their sweat, and they looked at the shape in the mud, and nobody said much of anything. A man named Boyd Tate, young and loud and sure of most things, said it was an old foundation washed out by some freshet years back, and an older man next to him said quiet that he didn't think so. Hiram stood a little apart from the rest and watched the stone and the men both, and he was thinking about the fact that not one of them had walked down to it. Men will walk up to almost anything in this world. They hadn't walked down to this. Over the days that followed, the river kept its slow retreat, and the shape kept coming, and what came up out of the mud was nothing any of them could fit a name to. The fitted plane opened into a low wall, dry laid, the stones dressed flat on the faces and set without mortar, and the stone itself wasn't the gray river rock of that bend. It was paler, denser, flecked with something that caught the low light, and it had been worked by hands that knew what they were doing. Hiram had built a root cellar and a spring house and a dozen dry walls in his time, and he knew dressed stone when he put his hand on it, and this was dressed in a way he couldn't place. Wade wanted to dig. The boy was all for it, down on his knees with a shovel before the sun was high, pulling the mud away from where the wall met the platform to see how far the thing went down. Hiram pulled him back. He told the boy to leave it be for now, and the boy asked him why, and Hiram couldn't give him a reason that sounded like a reason. There was a feeling on the flats that was hard to name, the air heavier than it should have been for the heat, and the birds that ought to have been working the mud for worms were nowhere on the bend. The river was quiet in a way that felt like it was listening. The town came down to look. They came in twos and threes and whole families, walking out from the houses set back in the hills to stand on the bank and stare, and still not one of them went down to the stone. A man would get to the top of the bank and stop there, and you could watch him think about going down, and you could watch him decide not to. They talked about what it might be: an old weir, a boatworks, a root cellar from before the war, a still house, the kinds of things a man says when he needs the strange thing in front of him to be an ordinary thing. None of them sounded right, and most of the men saying them knew it. The women came down too and stood further up the bank with the children, and they didn't say much at all, and Hiram noticed that none of them let the children go down to the water the way they usually did on a hot afternoon. The whole bend had decided something without deciding it out loud, which is the way a small place makes up its mind when the matter is one nobody wants to be the first to name. It was the boy who brought Granny Verda down. Wade had heard the old woman talk all his life, the way every child in that bend had, and he told Hiram one evening that if anyone knew what the stone was, it would be her. Hiram didn't argue. They sent a wagon up the hollow the next morning and brought her down to the bank in a chair in the bed of it, because her legs wouldn't carry her the walk. She sat wrapped in a shawl in the July heat and looked out at the flats for a long time before she said anything at all. Verda Sossaman was somewhere past 70, and she had been the memory of that bend since before Hiram was born. The woman you went to when a question went back further than the living could answer. She watched the shape in the mud, and she didn't ask to go closer, and that alone told Hiram more than anything she was about to say. When she finally spoke, her voice was thin and even, and it carried out over the bank the way an old woman's voice will when she's saying something she has waited a long time to say. She said the shape wasn't new. She said her grandmother's people had a word for it, a word in a language none of them spoke anymore, and the word meant the stones that were paid for. She said that long before the first white man cut a tree on that bend there had been people there who built in stone and kept to themselves and didn't trade, and didn't war, and didn't leave. She said the river had risen one autumn, fast and high and out of season, and it had taken them, every one, and the old ones who came after said the bend was paid for. What the river takes, it keeps, and a man doesn't make it give anything back. She said the stone people hadn't been warlike and hadn't been poor, and that was the part the old ones repeated most, that there had been nothing wrong with those people that should have made the river take them. They had built well, and they had kept to themselves, and they had minded the bend, and the river had taken them anyway, because the river doesn't take a thing for a reason a man can understand. The reason belongs to the river, and the bend was the price of being allowed to live beside it at all. She said her grandmother's people had known the word for the stones, and had also known the rule that went with it. The rule was that you didn't look for them, and you didn't speak of them above a whisper, and you didn't, on any account, try to take them out of the mud when the river let them show. The river letting the stones show wasn't a gift, she said. It was a test. It was the river finding out which of the people on the bank were going to reach into its hand, and the ones who reached were the ones it kept next. Hiram listened to that and didn't say anything. He thought about the fact that he had already been out to the stone twice, and that the boy had been out with him, and that the old woman knew it without him having to tell her. Hiram listened and didn't say what he was thinking, which was that the old woman was telling him to leave the stone alone, and that he already knew he was going to have a hard time doing that. The men on the bank listened too, and some of them shook their heads, and some of them nodded. Boyd Tate said loud that it was a story for children, and the stone was a foundation and they would dig it out and be done. The old woman didn't answer him. She looked at the boy, and then she looked at Hiram, and then she had them take her home, and she didn't come back to the bank. What made it harder was that the whole valley was already arguing about exactly this kind of thing. For years the men up and down the Ohio had been turning up great earthworks in their fields, mounds and long walls and circles of raised earth, and nobody could agree on who had put them there. The common word for the builders had been a vanished race, a people who were gone before the Indians came, and a man could fill an evening in any landing tavern with talk of who those people had been. The college men out east had begun to say it was the ancestors of the Indians all along, and the men in the taverns didn't like that answer much. But the argument was alive in 1898 in a way it isn't now. Every man up and down the valley had heard of the great serpent cut into a hill down in Adams County. Its body was 1,000 feet of raised earth, curled to swallow something no one could name. Over toward Newark there were the big geometric enclosures, walls of earth laid out in circles and octagons so precise a man couldn't match them with a modern transit. They had been there 2,000 years, and nobody could agree on who had built them or why, and the not knowing had gotten into the water of the place, into the way people talked, and the way they didn't talk. A bend that had been arguing for a generation about a vanished race was a bend ready to believe almost anything it pulled out of the mud. So when a thing of dressed stone came up out of the riverbed at Benton's Landing, every man on that bank already had a place in his head to put it. The ones who believed in the vanished race looked at the stone and saw their proof. The ones who believed the college men looked at it and saw a mistake or a fraud or an old foundation they hadn't gotten to yet. What none of them did was go down and put a hand on it, because the old woman's story had sat down on the bank with them, and a story about what the river keeps has a way of making a man's feet heavy. Word went upriver the way word does, and inside a week a man came down from the state college to see the shape. His name was Aldous Trent, and he was young for the authority he carried, clean-shaven and stiff-collared in the heat, with a leather case of instruments and a manner that told you he had come to settle a question and not to ask one. He walked the bank and looked at the flats, and listened to the men, and didn't listen to them. He told Hiram he was sure it was a collapsed root cellar or an old weir washed out by a freshet. It was the kind of thing a river will uncover, and a college will have to come down and explain to the people who found it. He said it the way a man says a thing when he has already decided it, and the men on the bank heard it, and a few of them were relieved, and a few of them weren't. Granny Verda had told Hiram plainly that no one was to go down to the stone, and Hiram hadn't gone down since. Now here was a young man in a stiff collar about to do the one thing the old woman had said not to do. Hiram didn't stop him. He told himself it wasn't his place to stop a man from the college, and he told himself that, and he watched Trent walk down the bank and out onto the flats alone. Wade asked him low whether they should go with the professor, and Hiram said no. He said the professor wanted to be the only smart man out there, and they could let him have it. The boy grinned at that, and they stood on the bank with the rest and watched the stiff collar get smaller as he walked out toward the shape. Trent reached the stone and set down his case and spent a long time on his knees with his instruments, and from the bank they could see him chip a piece off the corner with a small hammer and hold it up to the light. He was out there the better part of an hour, and the whole time the bend was quiet. When he came back he wasn't the same man. He didn't laugh about superstition on the way up the bank, and he didn't call it a root cellar, and he didn't say much of anything until he had his collar loosened and a cup of water in him. Then he told Hiram two things, and he said them quiet so the rest wouldn't hear. He said the stone wasn't local to that bend, and the dressing wasn't any technique he could name or had read about, and he would be back with men and equipment to dig it proper. He left that same night on the late boat, and the bank watched him go, and nobody said a word. Hiram stood on the bank after the boat had gone and thought about the look on the young man's face when he came up off the flats, and he understood something he hadn't understood before. The legend hadn't been what scared the college man. The college man didn't believe in legends. What scared him was the stone itself, the fact of it, the thing his instruments had told him that he couldn't fit into any book he had read. A man can argue with a story. It's harder to argue with a rock that shouldn't be there. Hiram went to bed that night with the feeling that the summer was going to get worse before it got better, and he was right. Trent was gone a week and the river kept dropping, and the town split down the middle over what to do. The diggers wanted to get the stone out of the mud before the professor came back with his crew, and the credit for the find went to the college, and they talked about it loud in the evenings at the landing shed. The Leavers wanted the river to take it back and be done with the whole business, and they talked about it quiet, which is the way people talk in that country when they mean it. Granny Verda sent word down the hollow that digging was the way a man made the bend unpaid for a second time, and she didn't send the word twice. Hiram was caught between them, and he knew it. He owed the old woman a great deal, and he believed her. And he also knew that a thing like that stone doesn't sit in the mud of a small bend forever without a man going out to look at it. He decided that he and the boy would go out one last time, at night, and mark the outline of the shape with stakes, so that whatever happened next there would be a record of how far it ran. He told himself it wasn't digging, and it wasn't, and he told himself it was enough, and he wasn't sure of that at all. They went out after the moon set, with a lantern and a sack of stakes and a maul, and what they found out there changed the shape of the summer. The platform wasn't one thing. The fitted stones ran out from it in a line, a wall or a road, set as straight as the platform was level, and it went down into the mud where the water hadn't yet receded and kept going. Hiram drove a stake where he could feel the line under the mud, and then another, and another, and the line didn't bend. He walked it out further than he meant to, following the fitted edge through the clay with the maul in one hand and the boy holding the lantern up behind him. The line kept going under his boots the way a vein of ore keeps going under a mountain, steady and unconcerned with the men walking over it. The stones under the mud were warmer than the mud around them, and that was the first wrong thing. Hiram didn't say it to the boy, but he felt it through the soles of his boots. Wade held the lantern and his face was white in it, and he said low that the thing was bigger than the town, and Hiram told him to hush and kept driving stakes. He had driven 11 of them when the line did something that made him stop. It didn't turn, and it didn't end, but it widened under the mud, the way a road widens where it meets a square. Hiram understood that what they were standing on wasn't a wall, and wasn't a road, but the edge of something, and that the something went out under the channel where the brown water still moved. He had a picture in his head all at once of the shape of it under the river, and the picture was too large. He didn't want the picture. He dropped the maul and turned the boy around, and that was when the water came. It was while they were out there that the river moved. There was no wind and no rain, and the channel was a low brown thread 100 strides out, and the flats around them were still mud, and then a swell came up out of nowhere and ran across the flats at their shins. It wasn't a wave off the channel. It came up out of the mud itself, the water rising through the clay, and it came fast and cold, and it nearly took the boy off his feet. Hiram caught him by the arm and hauled him back toward the bank, and the lantern went over and the stakes scattered, and by the time they got to firm ground the swell was gone and the flats were mud again. They found the flatboat the next morning. They had left it tied at the bank the night before, and it wasn't at the bank now. It was a quarter-mile up the bend, sitting high on a bar of mud, and it was full of river mud to the gunnels, full in a way no current in that dead channel could have managed. Hiram stood at the water line and looked at it and didn't say what he was thinking. The river had moved the boat the way a man moves a chair out of his path. And the river didn't have hands, but it had done it anyway. Wade didn't say anything either. He had gone a color that boys go when they have seen a thing they will have to live with. Hiram spent that day on the bank with the men who came down to see the boat, and he let them talk and didn't correct any of it. One said the rope had rotted, and one said a freshet had come down off the hills in the night, and one said a boat tied wrong will work loose in any current. Every one of them was reaching for the answer that didn't require the river to have a mind. Hiram didn't argue, because arguing would have meant telling them about the swell that came up out of the mud, and telling them that would have meant admitting he had been out there at night against the old woman's word. He wasn't ready to say either of those things out loud yet. He let the rope-rotted story stand, and the men let it stand. They all knew it wasn't the truth, and they all preferred it to the truth, which is something a man can do in a small place, when the truth would cost a man too much. Boyd Tate didn't listen. Boyd was the loudest of the diggers and the surest, and the swell and the boat hadn't put the fear into him the way it had into the others, or if it had, he wasn't going to show it. He went out alone in the middle of the night with a shovel and a lantern and a head full of the credit he was going to get, and what came back of him wasn't the man who had gone out. They found him at first light sitting on the bank in his clothes, soaked through to the skin, the shovel gone and the lantern gone, and he couldn't say clearly what had happened out there. He kept saying the same two things. He said the stones were warm, and he said the water had come up out of the mud and not from the channel. He said it had come up slow and then all at once, and he said it had taken the lantern out of his hand and not him, and he couldn't explain why. Hiram sat with him on the bank and got him home and put him in dry clothes, and the boy didn't speak for the rest of that day, and by the next he could talk again, but he wouldn't talk about the flats. He wouldn't go near the river again for as long as he lived in that bend, and that wasn't a long time, because he left the valley before the summer was out. Hiram understood it then, sitting with the boy and listening to him not talk about it. The legend the old woman had told wasn't a story about the past. It was a description of what the river did when a man made it give something back. The autumn the river had risen and taken the stone people, it hadn't been a flood. It had been the river collecting. And now the drought had made it open its hand, and every man who reached into the hand was going to learn what the stone people had learned, which was that the river doesn't lend. The telegram came the day after Boyd went out. It was from Trent upriver, and it said the river above them had risen unexpected, and his boat couldn't get through, and he would come when the water allowed. Hiram read it and thought about the timing of it, how the river had risen up there just when a man was trying to get back down here, and he didn't believe in coincidence the way he didn't believe in root cellars. The river was sealing itself. It had opened its hand for the drought, and now it was closing it again, and it was going to close it on anyone still standing in the palm. The drought broke on a Thursday, and it didn't break gentle. A wall of dark weather came down the valley out of the northwest, and the rain started in the afternoon and didn't stop, and by dark the river, which had pulled back 100 strides from the bank, was climbing back over the flats. Hiram stood on the bank in the rain and watched the brown water come, and he could see the line of his stakes going under one by one, and beyond them the pale stone of the platform going gray as the water found it. He had one night to decide what kind of man he was going to be about it. He could go out there with the boy and a maul and a rope and haul what stones he could before the water took them. He could set them on the bank and prove to the valley and the college and every man who had stood up there that the thing had been real, or he could let the river have it back. He thought about Boyd sitting on the bank in his soaked clothes, and he thought about the boat full of mud a quarter-mile from where he had tied it, and he thought about the old woman's word for the stones that were paid for. He knew which one he was going to do a long time before he admitted it. Granny Verda came down to the bank one last time, in the wagon in the rain, and she was the one who said it out loud so Hiram didn't have to. She said the bend was paid for once, and what the river takes it keeps, and a man who tries to take it back is buying trouble he can't afford. She said it wasn't cowardice to leave a thing alone that the land had decided to hide. She said it looking at Hiram and not at the river, and Hiram nodded once, and the old woman had them take her home, and that was the last he saw of her in the rain. Hiram made his choice. He didn't dig. He walked out to the edge of the flats where the water was already over his boots, and took the boy by the shoulder and turned him around. They came back up the bank and stood in the rain and watched the brown water close over the stones. The platform went first, the pale dressed stone going dark and then gone. Then the line of the wall running out into the channel went under. Then the last corner that had caught the lantern light the night before slid under the brown water and wasn't there anymore. Wade didn't cry and neither did Hiram, but they stood there a long time after there was nothing left to see. The rain came down on the brown water and the brown water didn't care. After a while the bend looked the way it had looked every summer of Hiram's life. Just a wide, slow piece of river with hills on both sides. The strangeness of that was the worst part. The river could give back a thing like that and then take it and then look as though it had never happened. The river went back inside its banks inside a week, and the flats were mud again and then grass again. By the autumn, you wouldn't have known anything had been out there except for the line of Hiram's stakes, which the water had pulled up and scattered and which he didn't go looking for. The landing went on the way a dying landing goes on, slow and quiet and not quite finished, and Hiram ran the flatboat across the few times anyone needed it and spent the rest of his days on the bank. He didn't go out to the channel at low water again, not that autumn and not in any autumn after. People who didn't know the story thought he had gotten lazy in his age, and people who did know the story knew better and didn't say so. Trent's boat never came. The telegram that finally arrived weeks later, after the river had gone back inside its banks, said he had reconsidered the project, and that the formation was likely a natural anomaly, not worth the expense of a dig. It was the kind of sentence a man writes when he has decided to forget a thing he saw. And Hiram read it and understood it, and he didn't blame the young man for it. A man can only carry so much of what the river gives back, and Trent had decided to carry none of it, which was a choice too, and not the worst one. Boyd Tate left the valley before the autumn was in. He moved north to a place where he didn't have to cross a bridge to get to work, the men who knew him said, and he wouldn't go over water in the rain for the rest of his years. He never spoke of the summer of 1898 to anyone, not to his wife and not to his children. And when he died up there, the people who knew him in the north knew nothing at all about why he had come to them. The river had let him go, the way it lets a thing go sometimes. But it had taken something out of him on the flats that night that didn't grow back. The town settled after that into two kinds of people, and it has been those two kinds ever since. There were the ones who decided the summer of 1898 had been a bad drought and a strange rock and an old woman's story. They said so whenever the subject came up, and they said it with a firmness that was louder than it needed to be. And there were the ones who knew what they had seen out there on the flats and didn't talk about it. Saying it out loud is the first step toward going back out there, and not one of them was ever going back out there. Hiram was one of those, and he ran the ferry until the river took him in his own time years later, and he never once looked at the bend at low water without looking away again. The bend at Benton's Landing is just brown water and a quiet bank now. And on the driest years, the old men say you can almost see the top of something out there where the channel goes shallow. The river kept what it was paid for, and the people who let it keep it lived out their years in peace. For the next story the mountains tried to keep, subscribe to The Hollow.